A Baker's Dozen at the Zetland Hotel by Ian Gordon. Regarding the Zetland Hotel. Situated a mere stone's throw from the North Sea, the Zetland Hotel offers pristine, boutique accommodation to those seeking escape from the tiresome trappings of modern life. This remarkable property consists of 13 glorious oceanfront rooms, 12 elegant chambers with 4-poster beds and roomy ensuites, and the inimitable Royal Suite, an outstanding space boasting capacious sitting areas, luxurious furnishings, large bathroom complete with sunken bath, and the pièce de résistance, a broad and uninterrupted view of the North Sea. Guests may read in the library or relax in the billiard room. A well-stocked bar is available for those in need of refreshment, day or night. And outside, 5 acres of private, manicured gardens offer an alternative to the public promenade. Rise at dawn to admire the eclectic topiary lit by the climbing sun. The Zetland Hotel. May your days and nights be golden and tranquil. Chapter 1. The Seeker in the Shadows. Ian MacDonald, said the short man with the jet-black hair, addressing the curious fellow behind the desk of the reception area at the Zetland Hotel. The hotelier, a tidy-looking individual with a plain face, nodded and added Ian's name to the guest book. After doing so, he turned to face the key rack to his rear. There were 13 hooks in total, each of which held a key, with the exception of the hook numbered 13. Clearing his throat, the plain-faced man unhooked the key to room 1, then, with Ian at his heels, took off along a narrow corridor in its direction. As they went, the hotelier's bland tones remarked, "I imagine you'll be rather comfortable in this particular suite, sir." "I'm certain," Ian agreed, looking about him vainly for signs of activity. "Any other guests booked in this evening?" he asked. To which the plain-faced man, his immaculate brogue striking the polished parquet rhythmically, simply nodded suggestively. Reaching the end of the corridor, the stilted hotelier proceeded to unlock the door to Ian's quarters for the night, and bade him enter, handing him the key as he did so. "If anything isn't to your liking, Mr. MacDonald, come see me at the main desk." "Sure thing," Ian replied, crossing the threshold enthusiastically. "You're more than welcome to explore the hotel," the hotelier continued, "but be mindful of other guests, particularly later, when we're at full capacity." Ian nodded, repeating, "Sure thing." Then, with some hesitation, the plain-faced man, whose colourless eyes looked past Ian rather than at him, added, "Perhaps you'll be especially mindful should you choose to explore the first floor. The guest in room 13 must not, under any circumstances, be disturbed." And like a broken record, the words, "Sure thing," fell from Ian's lips. The hotelier nodded and retreated, the echo of his gentle footfalls filling the room. Ian, with a newfound sense of excitement, studied the room, lapping up his surroundings like a hungry hound. It was elegant indeed, a sparsely furnished suite betokening the kind of contemporary luxury one might associate with a serviced apartment in Copenhagen or Stockholm. But the coffee-bean 4-poster bed, writing table and clothes rack were of no real interest to the Zetland Hotel's latest guest. The short man with the jet-black hair had travelled from his home in Ripon to the Redcar and Cleveland coast on the back of a rumour. It was an old rumour, a rumour printed on the pages of a little-known early 20th century travel book called Smith's Travels in Cleveland. In the book, the forgotten writer, Charles Allen Smith, spoke of an intriguing painting he'd observed adorning the wall of an inconspicuous corridor on the second floor of the Zetland. "Unlit are the corridors belonging to the second floor," wrote Smith. "One gets the impression that the proprietors prefer it that way, dark and dusty, to deter the would-be explorer. But I'm not so easily dissuaded. Up into the shadows I went, torch in hand, roaming the halls with the courage of a ghoul. If one is thorough, and walks with head high, then one is certain to discover a magnificent portrait hanging in the gloom. The identity of its haunting subject is a mystery, of a lineage seemingly unknown to the proprietors, a dazzling beauty left to brood in the shadows, of a hand apparently gone from this world." What had attracted Ian MacDonald to the rare book in the first place was anybody's guess. Even the charity shop in which it was found was far from his usual haunts. But there was something in the description of that painting on page 113 that filled him with an ineluctable yearning. Uncovering no other references to the mysterious portrait online, cyberspace being the source of all worldly knowledge as far as he was concerned, he set his sights on the Zetland that very afternoon and made the 50-mile journey in just under an hour. It wasn't the most impulsive thing he'd ever done, but it was sure to come close. He simply had to get a look at her, the beauty in the gloom, the brooder in the shadows. Wasn't there something tragic about that? Tragedy tinged with, perhaps, romance? And it was with thoughts of surreal romance in his head that the short man with the jet-black hair established himself at the Zetland, unpacking a few choice items for the task ahead. A torch, a face mask, for Ian couldn't cope with the idea of filling his lungs with cobwebs, and a compact digital camera. He'd wait a while, though, before setting off on his quest. Wait for the hotel to fill up a bit. After all, the hotelier had implied that there would be other guests in addition to himself and the enigmatic guest in room 13. Armed with a glass of tap water, Ian strolled to the window and gazed out towards the North Sea. It was 2 p.m., a December 2 p.m., and as such the waters were already dark, recently abandoned by the fleeting winter sun. He watched the waves, noted the lack of pedestrians on the esplanade, looked forward to the little adventure that awaited him. "I might have an hour," he muttered to himself, turning to admire the inviting four-poster bed that occupied the majority of the room. In short order, sleep followed. An hour or so later, Ian awoke to the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside. He'd slept rather heavily in his new, unfamiliar environment, and fully clothed, so it was with a mixture of lethargy and confusion that he climbed to his feet and wandered to the ensuite in order to splash water on his face. Returning to the room proper, he approached the door to his suite in order to eavesdrop. The hotelier was unlocking the door to a room a few doors down from his. A discourse was in progress, but he couldn't make out the voices clearly enough to discern the words. Moments later, Ian heard the door close and listened to the retreating footsteps of the hotelier. At least one other guest had arrived. To confirm this, he kicked his shoes off and left the room briefly, tiptoeing along the length of the corridor towards the reception area to survey the key rack behind the desk. Not only had one other guest arrived, but 3. The keys to rooms 2 through 4 were now missing from the key rack. Rooms 1, 2, and 3 were located to the west of the reception area, with rooms 4, 5, and 6 located to the east, and it was in this latter direction that the short man now observed the hotelier admitting the fourth arrival to room 4. He didn't manage to catch sight of the guest, just the back of the plain-faced man, as he followed the visitor into the suite. Yes, sir, 5 rooms full," Ian muttered to himself jovially, before creeping back to his room. Once more he splashed water on his face in an effort to rid himself of the sluggishness his afternoon snooze had brought about, then grabbed the bits and pieces he'd put aside earlier. Seconds later, he was out in the corridor again, inching along its outer edge, keen to avoid the prying eyes of the odd hotelier and his new neighbors. His shoes remained off for the journey. Silent running was essential. Reaching the reception area, he saw that the hotelier was standing at a filing cabinet with his back turned, busying himself with generic duties. Ian immediately took the opportunity to make a dash for the stairs, 2 flights of which were located either side of the sizable mahogany desk. Up he flew, swift as a bird, till he found himself standing by the door to room 13, a door twice the size of the door to his room, a vast suite located directly above the reception area. Giving the room little to no thought, he turned his attention to yet another flight of stairs, which continued upwards to the 2nd floor. Ignoring the staff-only barrier, he hopped it as a child might skip a rope, and climbed 2 steps at a time into the darkness above. "If one is thorough and walks with head high," Ian quoted from memory, flicking his torch on, "then one is certain to discover a magnificent portrait hanging in the gloom." Reaching the top of the dark stairs, the short man found himself standing amongst the clutter of yesteryear. The beam of the torch disclosed all manner of disquieting shapes, numerous objects of varying size disguised by dusty white sheets. It was a landing area of sorts, in which several uninviting doors and corridors, offering further avenues of discovery, met his inquiring eyes. Not only was it dark, but also silent as the grave, a space allowing for only Ian's erratic breathing and the beating of his heart. For a while he wandered the dusty halls as a mouse might explore a maze, occasionally sniffing the air in order to acquaint himself with previously uncharted locations. But wherever he went, the corridors were bare and the doors were locked tight. All at once, it occurred to him that this Smith character had spoken of this magnificent portrait over a century ago. What were the chances of it still hanging there today? The thought arrived just as he discovered a new fork in the road, a slim passage that he would have surely missed had the beam of his torch targeted the wall to his left a moment too late. Following this passage, Ian reached a small space enclosed by a vaulted ceiling, at the end of which, where one might expect to find a window overlooking the ocean or the hotel's expansive lawns, hung a large picture frame, an empty picture frame. The short man's disappointment was abrupt and harsh, a punch to the gut the likes of which he'd never felt before. "Damn," he mumbled weakly. But as he approached the frame, some 5 feet square it was, he saw that it wasn't empty after all. The frame housed a canvas, painted a light olive green. As Ian's torch shone upon it, he saw that it was highly reflective, slick in places. Closer still he crept, and was baffled by a sudden sensation of dampness as his sock-covered foot trod on something. Pointing the torch at the parquet, he observed a number of splodges, blobs of pink paint directly below the picture frame. Now, it wasn't in Ian's nature to jump to absurd conclusions, but the sight of this glossy olive-green canvas, coupled with the rosy wet globules of paint on the dusty floor, instilled in the short man the fanciful idea that the painting's subject had climbed out of the frame, like a burglar climbing through a window on a rainy night. And as much as he knew this to be false, he couldn't shake the impression, and was overcome by a tremendous desire to depart this scene of high strangeness. He removed his paint-soaked sock and retreated, moving swiftly in the direction of the lower levels. But as he renegotiated the interminable passageways, he felt absolutely certain that he wasn't alone. There were no figures in the gloom, no sounds emanating from the locked rooms, just an awful, tantalizing impression that another soul was nearby, wandering the silent halls. It was only later, when he reached his suite on the ground floor and locked the door behind him, that he let out the breath he'd been holding for what felt like an eternity. The disappointment and certainly the fear he'd felt dissipated rather quickly, though, usurped by an overwhelming sense of urgency. "I have to get out of here," he blurted. Within 5 minutes, Ian MacDonald had checked out of the Zetland Hotel and was sitting in his car, looking up at its strange silhouette against a sapphire sky. What just happened? He asked himself. But as he pulled away from the Zetland, turning his attention to the road in front of him, he thought not so much of the strange painting in the attic, nor of his seemingly inexorable desire to see it, but of the way in which the unremarkable hotelier bade him farewell, not with a frown, but with a grin. Chapter 2. The Girl at the Window. Emma Norling arrived at the Zetland Hotel a little after 2:30 p.m. that chilly December afternoon. She'd had business in the market town of Gisborough, a stressful affair involving an ailing relative. Aunt Ethel had become quite the cantankerous old spirit in her golden years, owing to her rapidly declining health.
"Dementia's a bugger,"
she'd yapped at Emma earlier that afternoon, prior to recognizing the young lady as her niece. Aunt Ethel, propped up in bed by the living-room window of her modest terraced house on Gill Street, had further unsettled Emma by repeatedly referring to an unwanted visitor she'd received the night before. A young girl, she'd said. A child, apparently hell-bent on climbing in through the window.
"I told her to bugger off,"
the old lady had sputtered, pointing with a gnarled finger at the window in question. In the end, Emma had succeeded in calming her down, assisted in part by her faithful companion, Amadeus, a 3-year-old dachshund. He was quite the charmer, that one. Amadeus seemed more than happy with his suite at the Zetland. A thorough sniffing escapade saw him occupied for well over 20 minutes, whilst Emma unpacked the scant supplies she'd brought along for the night. The 20-something hadn't stayed at the Zetland before. When seeing to her aunt on previous occasions, she'd spent her nights there in Gisborough. But something had called her to the old hotel this year, something inexplicable. Perhaps she'd had a yearning to gaze at the ocean, or to immerse herself in luxurious surroundings for a change. The drab single bed in the back bedroom at Aunt Ethel's was difficult to stomach night after night. Whatever the reason, she was going to make the most of her evening at the Zetland. Tired and concerned for her aunt, Emma lay back on the sizable bed and allowed her mind to wander. Amadeus joined her immediately, providing that special comfort unique to canines. After a while, she drifted off and slept contentedly and uninterrupted for several hours. Various images came to her as she slept, not quite dreams, but impressions, planted in the back of her mind earlier that afternoon, as she'd listened to the incoherent ramblings of her aunt. And though she'd been undisturbed by them whilst unconscious, her waking mind found them difficult to process. Wide awake now, she climbed to her feet and approached the window, eager to admit some fresh air. Beyond the glass, she observed the dark ocean in the distance. It was very calm, she noted, partially lit by a bright moon that was just out of sight. There was very little activity beyond the hotel, none as far as she could see, just the ebb and flow of the plentiful waves and the intermittent flapping of the Union Jack that guarded the entrance to the hotel. She was about to reach for the window latch when Amadeus appeared at her feet, growling. What he was growling at, Emma hadn't the foggiest, but he appeared to be looking up at the window, where absolutely nothing of note attracted her attention.
"What's up, boy?"
she asked, her youthful face a mask of concern. Amadeus barked a couple of times. Soft barks they were, intended to convey a message of some sort.
"Something outside?"
Emma continued, motioning towards the glass. The sausage dog barked again, a single bark this time, which his master interpreted as yes. Frowning, Emma turned her attention back to the window. A dog's instincts should never be ignored. If a dog's attention is acutely focused on something, then it might very well be aware of something its master is not. Emma knew this only too well. Amadeus had come through for her before. Just 6 months earlier, a prowler had attempted to gain access to her home in Bradford. The intruder had successfully picked the lock belonging to the back door, and if it hadn't been for Amadeus's uncanny senses and subsequent barking, the prowler would have made it inside to fulfill some nefarious objective. So, whatever it was that had caught his attention on this occasion, she was eager to investigate. Room 2, after all, was on the ground floor. It wouldn't be beyond the realm of possibility for a particularly motivated intruder to force the window open. But somehow she doubted that was the case. Something else was afoot here. Emma's thoughts returned to the conversation with her aunt earlier that afternoon.
"I told her to bugger off,"
Aunt Ethel had said, referring to the insistent girl she'd claimed had visited her in the night.
"And did she?"
Emma had replied.
"I reckon so,"
her aunt had affirmed.
"Not been back since."
Emma shuddered then, as Amadeus resumed his low growling.
"What's going on, boy?"
she pressed, bending down to stroke his shiny head. Once again, the dachshund barked a couple of times, trying desperately to communicate his instinctual knowledge of some dreadful phenomenon. Then Emma became aware of a presence at the window, saw it lingering there in the periphery of her vision, the hairs on the back of her neck climbing like flowers seeking the sun. Amadeus's growling ceased, abruptly cowed in the shadow of whatever it was that was hovering there. Emma knew what was standing there, knew it was precisely the thing that had visited her aunt just a matter of hours earlier. But why had it come to her? What did it want with her? Still, she refused to look at the thing that had reduced her faithful companion to a browbeaten chicken. And then it spoke. The voice of a child, indeed, sounded without.
"Can I come in?"
Emma very much wanted to look, was desperate to put an end to the torturous suspense. But her gaze remained fixed upon Amadeus's cowed head. She had to hand it to her little companion. His brown eyes were studying the girl at the window unwaveringly, in spite of his fear, and as Emma looked into those eyes, she could just about see the outline of the strange figure reflected in them.
"Can I come in?"
came the muted voice again, delivered with precisely the same timbre as before. Nervously, Emma stroked Amadeus's head again, refusing to look away from him, refusing to acknowledge her troubling visitor. 1,000 thoughts ran a track through her mind. What did the girl want? Where did she come from? Had she followed her to the Zetland from Gisborough? What had she wanted with her aunt? And lastly, what would it take to get rid of her? and then once again the harsh words of her belligerent aunt flashed into her mind.
I told her to bugger off.
Could it be as simple as that? At that very moment, Amadeus broke eye contact with the strange figure, and, like he'd heard Emma's thoughts, issued a soft bark, the gentlest she'd ever heard her little pal muster, a bark of encouragement. Full of resolve now, Emma turned to the window and came face to face with the girl as she said again,
Can I come in?
But it wasn't a girl. Nothing of the sort. Emma frowned as she beheld it. A thing like a doll with a rubber face, soot-black eyes with a wide, grinning mouth, straw-like hair short and dishevelled. Even as she looked, its thin, pale neck seemed to be expanding and contracting, lifting the weird head up and down, a sight that both shocked and sickened her. But those eyes held her gaze, so that after a moment or two she found it impossible to look away, those empty pools into which all of her restraint seemed to dive and drown. Aunt Ethel wouldn't have noticed, was too far gone to have noticed. She'd have been far too preoccupied with the notion of getting rid. A stranger seeking admittance to her property in the middle of the night? No chance, girl or creature. With the image of old Ethel's creased countenance in her mind, Emma was able to momentarily distract herself from the penetrating stare of the thing standing before her, and, as she did so, coughed up a marching order worthy of her aunt.
Won't you just bugger off?
And just like that, it was gone. It skulked away, collapsed from view, and verily rolled away, disappearing amongst the hedges lining the Zetland's perimeter. But for all the oddity she'd just experienced, Emma wasn't overwrought. She hadn't felt threatened by the mysterious caller, merely annoyed, as though the purpose of the thing was to test her resolution for some reason or other. She'd certainly have a tale to tell when she reunited with Aunt Ethel the following morning. Amadeus barked again. Emma looked down at him, and was thrilled to see his short tail going like the clappers, an expression of elation on his canine chops. She'd call it a smile, if she didn't know better. Chapter 3. The Man of Steel. John Burroughs was a creature of habit. A wizened character at the ripe old age of 72, he spent his Christmases by the sea, year in, year out. He'd retired in his 50s, forced out of work by a particularly nasty accident at the steelworks, his place of employment for over 30 years prior. Like the steelworks, which stood derelict on the banks of the River Tees, John had seen better days. The years since retirement had been unkind. A stroke at 59 had impeded his ability to get around without the aid of a walking stick, and the onset of macular degeneration in his late 60s had taken a substantial toll on his vision. But he was a tough old dog, a fighter in every sense of the word, and persisted with his annual routine come rain or shine. This year, though, rather than renting a cottage in Runswick Bay or a roomy apartment further down in Whitby, as he'd done many times before, he'd booked an evening stay at the Zetland Hotel. John, a Redcar and Cleveland native, was more than familiar with the place. It had stood there on that hillock overlooking the turbulent North Sea for as long as he could remember. But he'd never been inside, had never possessed the inclination to do so. But this year, for reasons unbeknownst to him, the Zetland had summoned him, and he was all too eager to answer its call. Besides, it was about time he saw its grand interior, traipsed along its tastefully tapestried halls, sipped tea by the window of one of its 13 glorious suites. limping up to the reception desk at around 3 p.m. The former steelworks employee introduced himself to the hotelier standing behind it, squinting to get a better look at the man. He was an odd-looking chap, John noted, and quite the stranger to him. In all his years he'd never seen him out and about in the locale. Not that his blurred vision was at all helpful in terms of achieving recognition. "Mr. Burroughs," acknowledged the hotelier, dangling a room key in front of his face. "This way, please." And the man in the unremarkable brown suit and polished brogues set off in the direction of room 3, John at his heels, just barely matching his pace. "I believe this is your first stay with us," the hotelier said, as he unlocked the ornate door. "Aye," John confirmed, lacking the wherewithal to add anything further. Small talk had never been his strong suit. The hotelier simply smiled in response to this, an empty smile, John thought, a hollow grin on a featureless face. 5 minutes later, John was sitting by the window in room 3 with a cup of tea, gazing out at the sea just as he'd planned to. There was a serenity about the place he hadn't anticipated, a calmness that stirred ancient emotions in his chest. He had it on good authority that there was a window on the first floor of the Zetland, through which one could view the steelworks, a unique vantage point, he'd been informed. The former employee, 20 years after retirement, still felt a connection to the works, as it was referred to in the area, despite the terrible injury he'd suffered there. In many respects, its vast chambers had been an extension of his home, his colleagues like family. Perhaps it was this sense of misplaced comfort that had contributed in some way towards the accident. He pondered this notion often. Finishing his tea, he left room 3 and made his way slowly up the stairs towards the desired window at the end of the corridor. As he went, he was careful not to disturb the occupant of room 13, mindfully limiting the force with which his walking stick struck the carpeted floor beneath his feet. The hotelier's request had been clear. Here was an individual to whom peace was priority 1. To disturb him would be to commit a great, great sin. Somebody important, no doubt, John now muttered to himself, contemplating the identity of the individual in room 13. Reaching the window at the end of the corridor, he pulled open the heavy crimson curtains and took in the vista before him. There, beyond the hotel grounds and the nearby rooftops, the gently undulating hills and the sprinkling of pylons, there on the horizon stood the old steelworks, faded and wraith-like in the dying light. For several moments, John stood rooted to the spot like a statue, transfixed by the silhouette of what he often considered to be his oldest friend. Where had the years gone? He contemplated, his thoughts awash with disconnected images. The vibrant orange of molten steel, the embers and the steam, the ever-present gloom, the familiar, raucous, resonating voices, and the filthy faces of colleagues long deceased. The light without was fading fast, and this, coupled with his deteriorating vision, made it increasingly difficult for him to make out the myriad pinnacles and chimneys, his old chums, the cooling towers and the blast furnace, and somehow it felt as though he was saying goodbye to the old place for the very last time. The finality of it all was devastating. And then the words fell from his lips. Goodbye, old friend. He hadn't intended to speak, hadn't thought he would feel this way, but somehow farewell needed to be said, and, for reasons unknown to him, it needed to be said right there and then by the oval window belonging to the first floor of the Zetland Hotel. Was this closure? Catharsis? Such thoughts flashed through his ailing mind. With only the distinctive, jagged lines of the blast furnace still visible to him as the sun moved on to other pastures, John closed the crimson curtains and exhaled heavily. He was a man dejected, but as always, John Burroughs picked himself up and trudged back along the corridor, the suggestion of a smile crossing his scarred cheeks. The scars were a result of the accident. Liquid slag coughed into the air. Take care of the slag, and the steel will take care of itself, was what they used to say down at the works. But John had been off his guard, drunk at the time, as he and his pals often were, after noon. It was hard work making steel. Back in John's day, a snifter at lunchtime helped settle one's nerves. But he'd had one too many. If it hadn't been for the quick thinking of his colleagues, he'd have surely croaked that fateful day. The slag had covered his face, shoulders, and arms. Scarred for life he was. The pain had been indescribable, not in the least nullified by the alcohol coursing through his veins. Liquid metal scorching flesh, muting nerves, boiling blood, seeking bone. But that was a long time ago. John had forgiven the old place. After all, it was his own negligence that had resulted in the mishap. Returning to his room, John, tired and melancholic, climbed onto the big old bed and sought the comfort of sleep. He'd lie there till it all went away, the haunting memories of yesteryear, the mournful reflections of the afternoon. And that was exactly what he did. He dreamt of new places, new possibilities, lakes, mountains, even cities, bright and sprawling. In the dream he walked with a newfound confidence. His gait improved. Even his vision was restored. And later, roused from sleep by a gentle tapping at his door a little after midnight, the wide smile that crossed his scarred cheeks was much more than just a suggestion. Chapter 4. The Wanderer in the Shadows. Julia Carlyle was mad as hell. Her boyfriend was up to no good. He was always up to no good. He was a thief. A petty one, but a thief nonetheless. The kind of thief that stole chocolate bars from the corner shop, grabbed himself a handful of cash from the busker's guitar case, that sort of thing. Julia, a hard-working barista at the mischievous grind in Ripon, had overheard a conversation that morning. Her boyfriend had been on the phone to a hotel on the coast, the Zetland. He'd booked himself a room for the night, and disappeared, hadn't even said goodbye. To be fair to him, though, he hadn't known Julia had been eavesdropping. She'd listened to the call while standing on the other side of his apartment door, poised to knock. And so, instead of pounding angrily at the door, she'd slinked into the shadows, watched him leave, then called the Zetland to book a room for herself. Whatever the idiot was up to, she'd get to the bottom of it. She'd catch him in the act and be done with the whole sordid affair. Swallowing down all manner of curses, she climbed into her car and set off for the coast. The journey was tumultuous. She took a couple of wrong turns, adding a good 30 minutes to the ride. By the time she reached the Zetland, twilight was upon the hotel. She parked down the street and entered the grounds on foot. The right thing to do, really. She'd spotted his Volvo poorly parked over 2 spaces in the car park. The last thing she needed was for him to see her car pull up alongside it. Entering the hotel's magnificent entrance hall, she approached the reception desk and ogled the brown-suited character standing behind it.
Carlyle?
She put forth in the form of a question. "Ah, yes," acknowledged the hotelier, turning his attention to the list of names in the heavy-looking guest book in front of him. Julia took the opportunity to have a quick nosy at the guest list and spotted the name of her boyfriend at the very top of it. Ian MacDonald, room 1, one night only.
There you are, you little bastard,
she thought to herself. The hotelier completed Julia's check-in, then escorted her to room 4. If anything isn't to your liking, Miss Carlyle, came the monotonous tones of the man in the brogues after conducting a tour of the suite. Come see me at the main desk.
Thank you,
Julia returned, questioning her decision to book the room under her real name. If she hadn't been quite so concerned with pursuing her reprobate of a boyfriend, she might have taken the time to get to know the hotelier a little bit. What a strange bloke he was, she thought. His face so plain and unmemorable. His voice generic and uninteresting. As the unassuming man retreated from the room, she thanked him again, an irritating act of repetition she just couldn't shake, and considered her strategy for the evening.
Knock on his door and question him outright? Nah, won't learn anything that way. Make a call to the hotel and ask for him? Put on a funny voice and ask him what he's doing here? Again, no, terrible idea.
Filled with an unquenchable desire for retribution for an act as of yet undetermined, Julia left room 4 and took off along the corridor, feigning casualness as she approached the reception area.
Gorgeous place,
she said as she passed the hotelier, and was momentarily creeped out by the unusual expression on his face. He had the blank, sightless stare of a dummy. It was as though she wasn't there, hadn't spoken. He paid her no mind whatsoever. The lady with the grudge continued through the entrance hall and entered the corridor on the opposite side in search of room 1. Her primary goal was to determine whether or not Ian was actually in the hotel. For all she knew, he might already be holed up in a pub somewhere, scheming. Locating his room at the end of the corridor, she contemplated her next steps.
Knock and hide? Knock and run? Or...
And just like that, she tried the door. Turning the handle, she was surprised to find that it was unlocked. In she slithered, cautious of every movement, every sound she made. The idiot was nowhere to be seen, but his shoes were there by the door. Naff charity shop trainers that screamed cheapness. She checked the ensuite, but he wasn't hiding in there either.
Where the hell are you?
Julia muttered under her breath.
If his shoes are here, then he's got to be here. Somewhere.
Scanning the room like a crazed, mechanical detective, she noticed a tatty book lying on the bed.
Smith's Travels in Cleveland,
she read aloud and quickly leafed through it.
What is he looking for up here?
She stopped at page 113. The corner of the page had been folded over, and a paragraph had been highlighted.
Unlit are the corridors belonging to the second floor,
she began, then read the rest silently, as the passage went on to talk about a certain painting, a portrait said to be hanging upstairs.
The bastard,
she cursed. Then, matter-of-factly,
he's come to steal the bloody thing.
She threw the travel book back onto the bed and went after her conniving boyfriend. But Julia Carlyle wasn't quite prepared for the task at hand. Ascending the stairs to the second floor, she was quickly engulfed by the darkness reaching down from above. Pulling out her smartphone, she tapped on its torch. Had to be careful with it, though. Didn't want Ian to see her coming. Dimming the light as much as the device allowed her to, she wandered the gloomy corridors on the lookout for torchlight, listening for footsteps. She detected neither. Had Ian been and gone already? Was it possible that he hadn't been up here at all? But now and then, as she roamed the empty passageways, she observed what looked like bare footprints in the dust beneath her feet. Footprints that seemed to have travelled in both directions. Prints belonging to the same feet, Or had others been up here recently, other barefooted individuals? A chill moved along her spine, took hold of the hairs at the back of her neck, produced a violent shudder. Something in the very air about her had changed. The old fight-or-flight mechanism had been engaged, and she took off running, not knowing from or towards what she was fleeing. Her boots pounded the old floorboards, generating clouds of dust through which she was forced to blindly plunge as she went back and forth, trapped like a bird in a cage. And Ian MacDonald was nowhere to be found. It was just Julia Carlyle up there, running in circles, frenzied. Stumbling across a passageway hitherto unexplored, she rushed along it, then ground to a halt before a lone picture frame. All was silent in that strange little space, a mausolean silence. The chilly air in there was heavy, humid, as though filled with the frequent exhalations of something lurking in the shadows, something waiting to pounce.
Is Ian in here?
Julia mused.
Who else could it be? Please be him.
But her reprobate boyfriend had already departed. This she saw confirmed by the presence of a series of footprints, the right one of which appeared to have stepped in something wet and pink on its way out.
What is that?
Julia looked up at the picture frame before her. The canvas inset was a light green and appeared to be glistening under the glare of her smartphone. A smell suddenly filled her nostrils, a pungent scent, a mixture of oils and solvents, paint. But Julia had no time to react. By the time the sensation of breath upon her neck had registered, she received an almighty shove and flew headlong towards the picture frame. Chapter 5. The Memory Maker. Elaine Olson was a quiet soul. At the ripe old age of 82, she'd booked herself a night at the Zetland Hotel in order to escape the humdrum existence her twilight years had become for her. She had few words for the hotelier upon check-in, gave her name and credit card details, and allowed the appropriately aloof individual to show her to room number 5. She'd stayed at the Zetland before, in the very same room 60 years earlier, when life was simpler. How fortunate that the hotelier had been able to offer her that room today, so many decades later. Within, she found it to be largely unchanged. The little alcoves and niches host to colourful lamps and vases. The paintings of strange animals adorning the walls, real and fantastical. The marble mantelpiece, with its elegant walnut clock and brass candle holders. Even the 4-poster bed, with its intricately carved pillars in the Georgian style. It was all as she remembered it. The view over the North Sea, the vista that had so often visited her on dark, uneventful nights, was precisely the same. She practically sprinted across the room to feast on that view, to inhale it like one's first breath, and to hold it there till their last. The broad sweep of green that belonged to the hotel, softly illuminated by several graceful lampposts, drew one's eye to the spectral waters beyond. Elaine just couldn't get enough of it. It was like stepping back in time. After a while, the quiet lady took a seat by the window and caught sight of a small object on the walnut bureau beside her. At first glance, she mistook it for a snow globe, before observing that its surface wasn't at all transparent. The sphere itself, which sat atop a small wooden plinth, looked to be made of solid ebony, or something very much like it. On closer inspection, the 82-year-old saw unusual striations crisscrossing the sphere. The image of a planet or moon sprang to mind, but she couldn't for the life of her name it. Drawn to it now, Elaine picked the object up, and with arthritic fingers trace the grooves across the surface of the sphere. She tapped it lightly and discovered that it was hollow, but there was no obvious way to open it, and so she simply held it in her hands, enamored by it. In all her long years, she'd never seen anything quite like it. She was certain it hadn't been there when she'd first stayed in room 5. An object so captivating would have been very memorable indeed. As the seconds ticked by, it seemed to Elaine that the sphere was radiating warmth. It was a gentle, comforting warmth that made it impossible for her to put it back down. It was intoxicating. Was this strange little object communicating with her? The more she focused on it, contemplated its origin and purpose, the warmer it became. How soothing it was, how wonderful. Such an insignificant little thing, really, barely the size of a fist, but so incredibly delightful. The sound of voices outside had Elaine climbing to her feet. Once more she approached the window and gasped as an unexpected vision met her gaze. Gone were the lawns and the dark ocean. Instead, she found herself looking upon a familiar scene from the distant past. The bustling esplanade of Redcar, its broad beach filled to the brim with joyous holidaymakers, locals and tourists alike. Children danced in the surf, adults huddled in groups, sharing hampers of food and drink, pies, sandwiches, pop and booze. And the extraordinary vision was expanding, wrapping around Elaine, pulling her in, so that now she could actually smell the hot dogs and the candy floss, could hear the shrill cries of the children, the gay banter of the adults, could feel the heat of the midday sun, taste the salt of the ocean in the air. Still clutching the strange little object, she looked down at her hands, expecting to find them crooked and wrinkled, but that wasn't the case at all. Her hands were youthful, plump and smooth, and the demure dress she'd worn to the Zetland had been replaced with a bright yellow two-piece swimsuit. She felt energized, reinvigorated. She was made again. And all the while, the tiny sphere gave off its curious heat, getting ever warmer and warmer, forcing her to cling ever firmer. She couldn't let go of it now, not after this. It was showing her so much. With a renewed sense of confidence and a great deal of excitement, Elaine took a few tentative steps towards the Navy Ocean. She was fully immersed in the phantasmagoria now. Nothing of the room at the Zetland remained. She was a real, moving part of this scene from the past, as much a part of it now as she had been back then, when she was young and burden-free. Back then, before the marriage and the children, the divorce and the grandchildren, the death of her oldest friends and her declining health. Prior to that had existed only days at the beach, when she was just another spirit at the beginning of life. No plans, no agenda. A young woman filled with boundless potential. The heat of the sand upon the soles of her feet was indescribable. When was the last time she'd felt such warmth? Through the jovial throng she meandered, past the snakes and ladders, the jigsaws, the Monopoly and the chessboards, past the flying disc throwers and the energetic dogs in pursuit, past the beach tents and the sandcastles. On she strolled, till her sensitive feet were gifted the cooling relief of the North Sea. Even in her present life, Elaine saw the ocean every day, but she couldn't remember the last time she'd seen it like this, felt it like this, balmy and tranquil, with such unabashed gaiety surrounding her. Umpteen inflatables decorated the calm waters, crocs and swans, flamingos and turtles, one of every color imaginable, or so it seemed. And the sun above, high in the summer sky, filled the hearts of all with a sense of optimism. It was infectious, even to the newcomer. But Elaine knew it wasn't real, knew that it was a glimpse only, a gift, courtesy of the strange object clutched in her hands. Hotter and hotter it was becoming, almost unbearably so. But still, her grip tightened around it, refusing to let go of either it or the magnificent experience it was providing. Sensing that the fantasy was reaching its peak, she turned and stared with bright, sanguine eyes at the scores of people filling the beach. She would take this vision with her, wherever she might go next. She'd remember the joy and the laughter, remember how the temperate sand felt upon her feet, the heat of day on her face. She smiled, then frowned, as the fiery globe shattered in her hands. A blink of an eye, and all was as it was before. Elaine stood by the window of her suite at the Zetland Hotel, gazing across the lawns towards the shadowy ocean, partially lit by a bright moon that was just out of sight. In her crooked hands were a number of ebony fragments. The sphere was irreparably damaged, just like her. But she didn't mind. For the briefest of moments she'd been given a second look at a world long since lost with the passage of time. A liberating experience, all in all. What the mysterious globe truly was, and why she'd been offered such a curious glimpse of the past, were questions Elaine Olsen would put to another guest at the Zetland, later that evening. Chapter 6. The Choir in the Fire. Pip Farmington asked far too many questions of the plain-looking hotelier when he arrived at the Zetland Hotel. He was a bit of a history buff, and issued queries by the dozen. Who built the hotel? When was it built? Who was the Earl of Zetland? What, for that matter, was the origin of the word Zetland? Shetland? How are the Shetlands connected to Redcar and Cleveland? Etc., etc. But the hotelier was unfazed by the experience. Not once did the expression on his face falter throughout the bombardment. He remained as cool as a cucumber, and listened with the patience of a saint. Eventually, the hotelier was able to distract his latest guest by unhooking the key to room 6 from the key rack behind him. 6, eh? Pip blurted. How good is that? Thick layers of zeal coated his every word. It's quite good indeed, sir, came the insipid tones of the hotelier. Moments later, Pip was following the brown-suited man in the direction of room 6. Grand place, isn't it? He observed, ogling the subdued tapestries embellishing the corridor. Yes, the hotelier agreed indifferently. Showing Pip to his room, the hotelier conducted his routine tour of the suite and once again issued the warning regarding the mysterious occupant upstairs. The guest in room 13 must not, under any circumstances, be disturbed. But unlike the others he had cautioned, Pip blurted, Why's that, then? That, the hotelier answered, is the business of the guest in room 13. Oh, said Pip, deflated. And off the man in the brown suit plodded, returning to his station. Left to his own devices, Pip, a 45-year-old teaching assistant from Beverly, studied his surroundings with fervor. He was very excited indeed. Christmas was holiday time. Every year, he'd take off in the old camper van for a week or two, exploring the countryside. He worshipped the cold, blossomed in the rain. He'd travel as far as a fortnight could take him, within the confines of Great Britain, of course. This year, he was on his way to Northumberland, had a hankering for Kielder water straddling the England-Scotland border. A UFO hotspot, allegedly, not to mention the lost villages purported to lie at the bottom of the lake. Pip was a high strangeness enthusiast, He loved all that stuff. Travelling north on the A174, he'd spotted the Zetland from the comfort of his van. An intriguing structure sat atop a small hill by the sea, a building he'd never noticed before, despite having passed through the area many times previously. Little did he know the place was a hotel with availability for the night, no less. And there he was, appraising the soft furnishings belonging to room 6, the chic net curtains, the fluffy throws straddling the leather club chair, and the plethora of colourful cushions on the 4-poster bed. He had a genuine interest in such things. As a matter of fact, there was very little the balding teaching assistant didn't find interesting, or so he was often inclined to say. And then there was the Christmas tree, an ornament standing in the corner of the room by the bed, modestly decorated with bright red baubles and gold tinsel. Pip was especially taken by this. Red and gold were his colours. While others would consider such a thing purely coincidental, Pip saw deep meaning in this. The hotel resonated with him. The tree had been decorated this way to please him. After all, hadn't the Zetland called to him from the main road? His happening upon the hotel was anything but coincidental. Pip decided to take a stroll through the hotel. He left his room on the ground floor and wandered into the library, accessed via the entrance hall. The reception area had been empty as he passed through it. A shame, really, as he was eager to pick the hotelier's brains with regards to the decoration of the tree in his room. The library was a humble space. It was a windowless room, some 20 feet square, with, naturally, row after row of books adorning the walls. But something else caught Pip's interest. A large inglenook fireplace on the north wall. It was a monster of a fireplace, he thought, a real beauty. In red brick, the hearth yawned before him, a salubrious fire burning within. And over to it he immediately went, his arms outstretched towards the flickering flames. It was so inviting. He sat cross-legged in front of it, listening to the crackle and snap of the logs therein. There was a rhythm to it, he thought, below which a low drone could be heard, just barely. But the drone intensified as he listened, and as it did, Pip began to discern its composition. It was made up of hundreds of voices, all of them bleeding together, male and female, each of them, it seemed, humming their lowest audible note. The result was appalling, a dreadful, dissonant noise that, once perceived, was impossible to unhear. The choir in the fire held Pip in its appalling grip, and as he sat there, rooted to the spot, he wondered just what it was that he'd fallen prey to. To whom did these voices belong? From where was this hideous cacophony emanating? From the inglenook, the fire itself, or from some other place beyond his ability to comprehend? The ghastly drone persisted. And now, in the flames before him, their incendiary dance framed by the gaping maw of the inglenook, Pip saw faces, terrible faces belonging to conical heads, all teeth and hollow eyes. These were the singers, the choristers of the fiery choir, humming their horrible melodies, teasing their victim. The razor-sharp teeth chattered as the low notes vibrated. The shadowy eyes captured his as the ardor of the choir reached its zenith. And then there were words, articulated by familiar voices. "Remember me, Pip? Remember what you made me do?" It was David Arnold, an old school friend, perished in a prank involving a supermarket trolley and a bus.
I saw you, Pip. Looked up at you the whole way down. Why did you let me do it?
Susan Buckley, a college roommate, jumped to her death from the Humber Bridge. "They're not worth it, Pip. Leave 'em be." Chi Lee, a family friend, died defending Pip in a backstreet pub brawl.
Why, Philip? Why didn't you help me? You could have saved me.
His very own mother, choked to death at the kitchen table. "Go away," Pip yelled. "All of you. Leave me alone." But still, the drone persisted, the menacing sound penetrating his gut, making him retch. "Accidents, misunderstandings, not my fault. I'm not accountable." And he was right, truth be told. He wasn't responsible for any of the deaths that had occurred in his company. But the guilt he carried was a burden that he had always struggled to bear, a burden that haunted his dreams day and night, a burden he attempted to mask by donning a bubbly persona and mock bravado. Mastering himself, he closed his eyes and sought a means of escape from the threatening choir that held him in place. Tears rolled down his cheeks as he saw the faces of the dead, the forlorn facades of those who had whispered to him, their reproachful words seared into his mind. But he refused to give in to them again, and instead climbed to his feet, turned his back to the ingle nook, and simply strolled away. The man that emerged from the library thereafter was different. He'd come face to face with his demons in there, an encounter he hadn't the energy to consider. Back to room 6 he went, heedless of the subdued tapestries that had so interested him just a little while ago. Nor was he concerned with the soft furnishings in the suite. He just wanted to rest. A part of him believed that the experience belonged to a dream he was having, a horrible nightmare from which he was desperate to awaken. He climbed onto the big bed, adopting the fetal position. Thoughts of his dead mother filled his head as he plunged into a dreamless sleep. Chapter 7. The Gambling Man. Mark Patterson just wanted a sea view. Granted, he'd arrived a little later than he'd planned to that late December evening, but he'd be sure to make the most of his 2-night stay on the morrow. The hotelier, a strange chap, Mark observed, had checked him into room 7, a fabulous suite on the first floor, directly above room 1, from the window of which one was afforded a splendid view of the North Sea. Even after dark, the ocean was visible, the hidden moon casting light across the murky waves. So bright was the orb that evening that Mark could discern a distinct horizon line, a clear divide between the waters below and the indigo sky above. "Thank you," Mark said, turning to face the hotelier. "If anything isn't to your liking, Mr. Patterson," the plain-faced man returned, only to be interrupted by his latest guest. "I'll be sure to give you a shout," Mark said, grinning awkwardly. "Very well," affirmed the hotelier, going on to offer once again a word of warning with regards to the guest staying in room 13. "Who's the guest?" Mark asked shamelessly. "I'm afraid I'm unable to divulge that information at the present time, sir." "Oh, I get it. VIP, eh? Now I have to know who it is." "Please, sir, heed my warning." Mark frowned. "Heed your warning?" "Let's not get ahead of ourselves, Mr. Patterson. It's a simple matter. It would be better for all concerned if the guest in room 13 remained undisturbed." Then, as Mark readied himself for further inquiries, the hotelier added, "To disturb the guest in question prematurely would be most unfortunate, sir." Mark frowned again, searching the hotelier's blank face for something to work with. A twitching lip, the blink of an eye, a facial tic of any kind. But all he found was an empty expression, devoid of motion. It was the poker face of the century. If only Mark had had access to this strange individual in Vegas the summer just gone, he might have walked away with a handful of dollars in his pocket, as opposed to a gaping hole. With nothing else to say to the oddball hotelier, he watched him leave and listened to the man's footsteps as he shuffled off along the corridor. What was all that about? Mark pondered. When he was sure the poker-faced fellow had descended the stairs, Mark popped his head out of room 7 and gawped in the direction of room 13, just down the hall it was, at the top of the stairs. Suitably intrigued, he left his room and sauntered in the direction of the mysterious suite. Reaching the landing area, from which room 13 was accessed, he examined its colossal door. It was of a dark wood, like ebony, with numerous corrugations traversing its surface, but whereas the doors to the other rooms had traditional handles, this one was equipped with a sizable 5-spoke affair, just like the kind typically attached to a bank vault. Mark put his ear against the ebon portal and listened, but all was silent on the other side. Perhaps the special guest was snoozing, taking a load off. The sound of heavy footsteps coming from the floor above startled Mark. Curious though he was regarding the identity of the guest in room 13, he didn't want to be caught with his ear up against the door. He skulked back along the corridor towards his room before the owner of the encroaching footsteps appeared on the landing. Driven by blind panic, as Mark closed the door to room 7, he immediately locked it. What it was that had brought about this sudden anxiety he couldn't say, but it hovered above him like a grey mist. Somehow, he felt that there was something strange afoot at the Zetland Hotel. "What's with that door?" he asked of the empty space about him, contemplating both its size and the weird handle affixed to it. Those heavy, resounding footsteps had troubled him too. Was he being ridiculous if he said that a subtle, dragging sound had accompanied those treads? Even so, why should that bother him? He was a guest at a handsome hotel by the ocean, the 8th guest at that. Others were bound to be up and about, roaming the halls. The hotelier, for all his idiosyncrasy, had, after all, said that Mark, too, was free to explore the place. Still, he didn't like it. Didn't like it one bit. He listened for a few moments longer, and, just as he expected, the heavy footsteps and a clearly perceivable dragging sound were heard out in the corridor along which his room was located. Then the sound ceased, and Mark heard a door open and close. Which room was that? 8 next door, or 9 next door but one? Nobody else had arrived since Mark checked in. So who was in there? A cleaner? The hotelier? What on earth were they dragging? An item of furniture? A body? It was all conjecture, but the man in room 7 was more than familiar with the concept of estimation. Mark Patterson, as implied by his time in Vegas, was a gambling man. He loved the thrill of it all. Blackjack, craps, poker, you name it. He'd play till it was all gone, every penny. Didn't know when to stop. His restraint was as rare as a solar eclipse. "There's no fun in holding your horses," Mark would say. But at 52, eking out a living on universal credit, not even a remnant of family in his immediate vicinity, a belly the size of a beach ball and an alcoholic's nose the color of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer's, perhaps he should have been practicing the fine art of holding one's horses. But he wasn't about to start now. He'd caught a whiff of something intriguing there at the Zetland. Something, though disconcerting, certainly worthy of investigation. And it was with a gambler's confidence that Mark unlocked the door to his room and took off again in the direction of the landing. Approaching the immense door belonging to room 13, he once again put his ear up against it, but still there were no signs of activity within. Then he heard something else, the rustling of paper on the ground floor. Tentatively, he started down the stairs towards the reception area. Just a couple of steps he descended, then knelt down to get a better view of the large mahogany desk below. Positioned behind it was the oddball hotelier in the brown suit, his curiously robotic hands in the act of folding sheets of paper and stuffing them into white envelopes. There were 15 packets in all, with what appeared to be names printed on them, but Mark, from his vantage point on the stairs, was unable to make any of them out. For whom were those letters intended? And Mark just couldn't shake the notion that there was something off about that man in the brown suit. The way he moved, the way he spoke. He was hardly a man at all, Mark surmised, deeply troubled by the fact that, even now, looking right at him, he found it impossible to register the details of the hotelier's face. How was it that this mysterious individual was so unremarkable? Back in room 7, Mark stood by the window, gazing at his translucent reflection in the glass. "Why did you come here?" he asked himself. "I don't know," his reflection answered, shaking its head. Looking beyond his poorly mirrored features, he caught sight of movement in the grounds below. A car was parked, and from it emerged a young lady in a light brown overcoat. Spotting Mark at the window, the new arrival raised a hand and waved in his direction. "Welcome to the Zetland," Mark mouthed, waving back at her. But there was no geniality in it, for the man with the gambling problem was quietly pondering just what it was that the young lady was walking into, what each of the guests cooped up at the Zetland that night had stumbled into. He considered checking out. The prospect of abandoning his delightful room with its comfortable sofa and massive 4-poster bed in favor of returning to that hovel on the edge of town, that council-owned flat with the ghastly neighbors and the unreliable storage heaters, that place in which he just barely managed to escape for a couple of nights, pouring an entire week's social security payment into his stay at the Zetland Hotel. "No way," he breathed. "I'll take my chances here." And so he did, dozing on the sofa in his room till precisely 12:07 p.m., when there came a gentle tapping at his door. Chapter 8. The Other Side of the Glass. Mary Henderson was another late arrival. The young mother of 2 had spent the afternoon in Middlesbrough doing some last-minute Christmas shopping. She'd wanted to be done and on her way home to Firely before sunset, but the children's letters to Father Christmas this year had been extensive. Starting out in Scarborough a little after 9 a.m., she'd been forced further and further up the coast in search of all the seemingly unattainable bits and pieces the kids had requested. The department store in Whitby wasn't stocking the items she sought, and the toy shop in Gisborough had sold out weeks ago. Where was a mother to find a copy of Minotaur Dungeon, for goodness sake? Thankfully, Boydell's Toys in Middlesbrough had everything she'd set out to find. If only she'd thought of good old Boydell's to begin with. But now she had to get home. A nervous driver at the best of times, Mary had no intention of making the journey back to Firely in the dark. The direct route over the bleak and treacherous moors was out of the question, and the long way round, via the A19 and the A64, was far too traffic-heavy. There was nothing else for it. She'd have to find a place to spend the night. There had to be somewhere with availability nearby. Having turned her nose up at a number of shabby chain hotels on the outskirts of Middlesbrough, she decided to brave the A174 and headed towards Saltburn. A series of bungled maneuvers, involving the jumping of a red light near Redcar and a brush with a wobbly cyclist in mask, saw Mary pulling over by the rather grand and aptly appealing Zetland Hotel. How fortuitous. But was it merely chance that had lured her there? She certainly thought so, as she parked up in the wonderfully manicured grounds and proceeded to the hotel proper, in awe of its stunning exterior. Its neat sash windows and red brick facade, the relentless climbing ivy, and the pillared front door. A silhouette appeared in one of the windows on the first floor. She waved without thought, and was touched when the stranger waved back. Then in she strolled with her head held high, excited by this dramatic departure from the norm. Marveling at the grand entrance hall, admiring the antique portraits and the flawless statues surrounding her, she approached the reception desk with a huge smile on her face. The man on the other side of it, a rather ordinary-looking chap, she thought, mirrored her grin, which only bolstered her delight.
"Hello,"
she practically yelled, her voice echoing throughout the broad hall. "Good evening," returned the hotelier, his voice flat and emotionless, clashing with the grin plastered across his cheeks. "Looking for a room for the night?"
"I am,"
Mary confirmed. "I've got just the one," the grinning hotelier declared, turning to the key rack behind him.
"Great,"
Mary bellowed, relieved. Unhooking the key to room 8, he turned to Mary again and asked, "Your name?"
"Mary Henderson."
The hotelier scribbled the name down in the guest book before him. As he filled out the details, his handwriting slow and measured, Mary caught sight of a piece of paper on the desk. Two rather unusual words jumped out at her: confess and repress. Unusual in that such words didn't belong in an upmarket hotel, didn't belong in any hotel as far as Mary was concerned. She couldn't put her finger on it, but there was something off about that piece of paper. What did it mean? And why was it just lying there for all and sundry to see?
Payment?"
Mary asked, distracting herself from the paper. "On checkout," the hotelier stated, then took off towards the stairs, gesturing for Mary to follow. The mother of two paid no mind to the huge vault-like door at the top of the stairs. She simply followed the hotelier along the corridor to the west and stopped alongside him by the door to room 8. Inserting the key into the lock, the grinning hotelier said, "I imagine you'll be rather comfortable in this particular suite, madam."
"I'm sure,"
Mary agreed.
"I can't wait to see it."
Opening the door, the hotelier stepped inside, and Mary followed. On the instant her booted feet made contact with the soft carpet within, she let out a gentle squeal of excitement and beamed anew. "If anything isn't to your liking," the hotelier began, "come see me at the main desk." Mary nodded, her attention focused on the contents of the suite, the gorgeous floral wallpaper, the majestic four-poster bed, the weeping fig by the window. And, of course, the hotelier issued his caution regarding the occupant of room 13, but Mary barely heard it. She wasn't in the least interested in the activities of other guests. She was lost in the moment, ready to make the most of what very well could have been a difficult situation.
"Thank you,"
Mary said, as the hotelier left her to it.
"What a room,"
she mumbled, then threw herself on the bed like a drunken teenager. She gazed up at the ceiling for a while. Even the coving was elegant. A dazzling chandelier hovered above her, crystal and brass.
"Beautiful,"
she whispered. Making a call to her husband, who, unsurprisingly, was concerned with regards to her whereabouts, she reassured him that all was well and that the requisite gifts had been obtained. She promised she'd be home first thing in the morning and said good night to him, telling him to pass on her love to the boys, Dexter and Mitchell. And that was about all she could manage. The hustle and bustle of the day caught up to her all at once. She closed her eyes and was instantly asleep. When Mary awoke later that evening, she felt eyes on her. It took a moment or two for her to adjust to her surroundings, the chandelier above her far too bright for her waking senses. She climbed to her feet and went in search of the light switch. Locating it, she flicked it off, choosing to rely instead on the glow of the little lamp by the bed. She scanned the room, searching for the source of that weird feeling. Nothing under the bed, nothing in the wardrobe, nothing in the ensuite either. And then she looked towards the dark curtains, the thick velvet curtains beyond which only a single pane of glass separated her from the world outside. Was something on the other side of that glass, floating there? She took a hesitant step towards the window, her tired eyes still struggling to focus on the shadowy realm beyond. There was something on the other side of the glass, the translucent silhouette of a person, a small person, a girl.
Hello?
Mary called timidly. As in response to the sound of her voice, the figure without acquired substance. In a matter of seconds it was opaque, a black shadow in the shape of a child.
Hello?
Mary called again, taking another step towards the window. And then the thing spoke, uttered the same few words it had uttered just a short time ago, when addressing the young lady below in room 2.
Can I come in?
All of the joy, all of the satisfaction Mary had felt prior to falling asleep faded to black the moment she heard that voice. It was a cold, clinical voice, foreign to the creature, spouting words it had replicated to fulfill a purpose. Mary, full of anxiety now, stood motionless, her gaze drawn to the strange caller. The longer she looked at the thing, the more she saw. Her eyes adapted to it, and she noticed its gaping mouth, its coal-black eyes. She desperately wanted to lunge forward to close the curtains, anything to blot out the sight of the creature.
Can I come in? Came
the voice again, as terrible as the first time. Mary was lost for words. She could only look and wince as the rubber-like face of the floating girl studied her, watched her intently, held her gaze almost effortlessly.
What do you want?
Mary managed, observing the peculiar way in which the creature's head appeared to be bobbing up and down ever so slightly. And again came the words,
Can I come in?
Ignoring the plea, Mary, overcoming her fear, made a mad dash for the curtains. She struggled frantically to break eye contact with the thing as she neared it, made a considerable effort to cover her eyes with her hands. But those murky pits were like black holes. They drew her towards them. And once they had her, surrendering to a higher power, Mary reached for the curtains with both hands and, miraculously, succeeded in pulling them closed. What became of the thing on the other side of the glass, she refused to ponder. All she knew was that she didn't have to look at it anymore, and with a bit of luck, wouldn't have to listen to it anymore.
What the hell was that?
Mary demanded of the empty room. But the room didn't answer, and there wouldn't be any answers till later that evening, a little after midnight. Chapter 9. The Brooder in the Shadows. Lucille Sharples was a little nervous when she arrived at the Zetland Hotel that evening. Some hours earlier, she'd received a text message from a friend of hers, a friend that had booked herself into the Zetland to track down her devious boyfriend. This friend, Julia, had been in a relationship with the troublemaker Ian for almost 2 years. 2 years too long, in Lucille's opinion. The pair never seemed to get along. Ian was always up to something. Get-rich-quick schemes and low-stakes gambling, an all-round selfish moron, completely lacking in sensitivity. Julia, Lucille's dear friend Julia, just seemed to put up with it, crippled by the belief that she was obviously incapable of doing any better. And this here was why Lucille was nervous. She was in love with Julia, had been for years. Reading Julia's text message, she'd interpreted it as the final nail in the coffin for Ian MacDonald. The object of her desire would undoubtedly find the pest up to no good and be rid of him there and then, providing Lucille with an opportunity to take his place. That was the hope, anyway. The Zetland was very quiet, Lucille observed, as she strolled up to the reception area. The man behind the desk, a man of indeterminate years, a vacant expression on his face, checked her in swiftly, then escorted her to room 9 on the first floor. She just about managed to catch a glimpse of the guest book during check-in, seeing that Julia was staying in room 4 downstairs. It hadn't escaped her attention either that the troublemaker, Ian, appeared to have checked out. Standing at the door to room 9, the strange hotelier issued a word of warning regarding the guest in room 13, which was just next door, saying that the VIP mustn't be disturbed under any circumstances. Well, that wasn't going to be a problem for Lucille. There was only one guest she'd come to disturb.
I'll be as quiet as a mouse,
Lucille stated, proffering a phony grin. Of that I have no doubt, the hotelier said, returning a similarly false smile. Leaving her to it, the man in the neat brogue slinked off along the corridor, leaving Lucille to unpack a few things, after which she intended to head down to room 4 to talk to Julia, if she was in her room, that was. Out came the fragrances and the carefully selected wrap dress, the fiery red lipstick and the indigo eyeshadow. It was the mating game Lucille was playing, and the attractive 23-year-old knew the rules inside out. But then something caught her attention, and she was immediately distracted from her preparations. On the north wall, by the door to the suite, hung a portrait, some 5 feet square, the subject of which was a woman bearing an uncanny resemblance to the lady she had come to see, Julia Carlyle. Lucille walked right up to it, found herself entranced by bright blue eyes and blonde, voluptuous hair. There was something off about it, though. Dark rings framed those azure eyes, and an expression almost of dread veiled the woman's delicate features. But still, Lucille found that she wanted to touch the portrait, and just like that, the tips of her fingers were tracing the subtle lines of the look-alike's face.
Who are you?
Lucille asked, her hands caressing the canvas. She felt a strong emotional connection to the image before her. It was so haunting, so lifelike, that Lucille found herself unable to look away.
Who are you?
She asked again, insistently. But the beautiful likeness simply glared back at her from its unreachable, two-dimensional realm.
What happened to you?
Lucille continued, saddened by the terrible expression staring back at her. But were those eyes looking at Lucille, or were they looking at something else? Turning, the 23-year-old's eyes fell on a figure standing in the corner of the room, a shadowy statue just visible by the south-facing window. Lucille approached the figurine. Life-size, with long, slim legs, the papier-mâché sculpture was that of another woman, and unlike the lady in the painting, this woman was a stranger to Lucille. The statue had been painstakingly rendered. Its elaborate features were positively aglow with an aura of realism. The face that looked back at her, a lovely face with wide, staring eyes, full red lips and slender nose, held the expression of one resolute, a lady full of tenacity. Between this gorgeous creation and the curious painting to her rear, Lucille was at a loss to explain the sensations pummeling her. And then a voice sounded.
Lucille.
It came faintly, a female voice, a voice Lucille thought she recognized as Julia's. Lucille scanned the room, from the statue to the four-poster bed, the wardrobe to the painting.
Julia?
She mumbled.
Is that you? Yes,
came the voice again, full of force this time.
Where are you?
Lucille asked, her eyes now drawn to the portrait.
I'm right here,
the disembodied voice of Julia announced, and Lucille was certain the sound had emanated from the painting, despite the fact the lips of the subject hadn't so much as stirred.
In the painting?
Lucille queried, doubt creasing the arch of her eyebrows.
Yes. Help me. I don't understand,
Lucille managed, transfixed and bewildered by the pained expression of the likeness before her.
The Brooder!
The voice of Julia yelled.
The Brooder! She's right behind you!
Lucille spun on her heel, found herself toe-to-toe with the questing figurine, its rigid face, a mask of paint, paper, and adhesive, searching hers. Lucille screamed, and then the Brooder in the shadows, the thing that had thrust Julia into the confines of the picture frame, raised its slim, inflexible arms and hurled Lucille into the painting too. The stiff figurine watched as the likeness of Lucille merged with Julia's on the canvas. Blue eyes blended with green, becoming a deep teal. Cheeks broadened, lips widened. Light hair turned dark and luxuriant. But the face, it was a mask filled with dread, amplified by shock. The statue with the long, slim legs stood perfectly still as the transformation took place on the north wall. Standing there before the painting, it was as though the papier-mâché figurine stood before a mirror. So perfectly reflected was its beautiful face on the canvas, a face that comprised the contrasting features of Julia Carlyle and Lucille Sharples, a face that over a century ago the writer Charles Allen Smith was so taken by, hanging on a forgotten upper-story wall of the Zetland Hotel. Chapter 10. The Descent. Annabel Marsh was exhausted. A Stamford, Lincolnshire resident, she'd left for the Zetland just after lunchtime, allowing for a number of stops along the way: Nottingham, Doncaster, and Northallerton, each location presenting an opportunity to catch up with old friends. Her ultimate destination, the hotel on the Redcar and Cleveland coast, presented a very different kind of opportunity. The chance to enjoy a little bit of luxury in the middle of nowhere, precisely what the 40-something needed. Why that particular hotel, she couldn't say. The place just kept on coming up wherever she looked. Internet searches coughed it up, and her Stay North travel guide for December featured a 2-page article on the place. It was fate, surely. In truth, though, she just wanted to get away for a couple of nights. The details didn't matter, so long as the place was clean. Annabel had had a tough year. Work had been arduous, thanks to a 6-month-long investigation of her company. Marsh, Ryder and James Limited, an accounting firm, had been accused of money laundering, with Annabel herself at the center of the allegations. Despite her protestations to the contrary, the powers that be had been unyielding, resulting in a great deal of trepidation on her part. In the end, not a jot of damning evidence was uncovered, and so the case was dropped, just prior to Christmas. A couple of nights at the Zetland Hotel would aid Annabel in her recovery somewhat. Its out-of-the-way situation was very appealing. No familiar faces, no accusatory voices. And so, after checking in to Suite 10 that evening, she ran herself a hot bath perfumed with lavender, and lay there quietly, listening to the ebb and flow of the North Sea. But she was still a jumble. A couple of unusual occurrences were at the forefront of her mind. The hotelier, an altogether inconspicuous fellow by all accounts, had irritated her slightly by telling her that she mustn't, under any circumstances, disturb the guest in the room next to her. What did that mean, exactly? Did it mean that she shouldn't put the television on? Shouldn't listen to the radio? What precisely made this mystery guest so special? Granted, the guest was bound to have paid a premium to stay in the royal suite, but then her room hadn't been a steal either. The other thing that had bothered the 40-something, albeit in a much more subtle fashion, had been the sight of someone gawping at her as the hotelier had shown her to room 10. This person, hard to see in the gloom of the passageway, had looked a little peculiar to Annabel, all rigid and thin, like a statue, if truth be told.
"What's that?"
Annabel had asked of the hotelier, and the inconspicuous fellow had answered cryptically, "I imagine it's a sculpture, madam." What had he meant by that? It either was or wasn't. Brushing these thoughts to one side, Annabel turned her attention to her glorious surroundings. The ensuite was a magnificent space, she thought, all monochrome, black and white floral wallpaper, grey floor tiles, granite basin. Lying there in the tub, she looked straight ahead at the black taps, touched them with her toes. The room was calming. Thoughts of recent traumas faded, and in the moments that followed, the descent began. Annabel Marsh had closed her eyes, had dozed off in the warm waters. At least, she thought that was what had happened. She slipped below the surface of the water and sank into the darkness beneath. But it wasn't a watery underworld into which she dropped. It was an insubstantial realm of shadow. She opened her eyes, but saw nothing at all, felt as though she were dreaming, succumbed to it. Further and further, she descended into the darkness, her awareness of such supported by the gentle sensation of being pulled downwards by invisible hands. But to where were the hands dragging her? There was no fear, no uncertainty whatsoever. She felt as one who dreams of impossible worlds, felt the excitement associated with the discovery of something fresh and novel. And then Annabel emerged from the realm of shadow, and found herself stretched upon a beach of pebbles. Looking about her, she saw a smattering of old boats, each battered and damaged beyond repair. The beach and the boats were enclosed by a dilapidated breakwater. She was at the center of a small harbor. The 40-something was immediately taken by the silence. Not a gull could be heard, nor the waves beyond the harbor. The cloudless sky overhead was a light red, suggesting that wherever she was, it was either late in the day or early in the morning. She took a few tentative steps towards the nearest boat, a green and white coble with the name Elaine on its stern. She moved on to the next one, another coble, this one grey and white, with the name John on its bow. There were 4 boats in all, each one bearing a name, though one was inaccessible, an orangish vessel out on the stagnant waters. The name of this one was illegible. Only the faded letters HI remained. The 4th boat, a red and white coble with shattered windows, bore another obscured name. If only Annabel could make it out. Why she had been brought to this place, in her dreams or otherwise, the 40-something was uncertain, but she knew that it was significant. She'd always been exceptionally sensitive in certain regards, spiritual regards, she might say. She'd known to intervene when a madman with a knife threatened a stranger on a night out in Leicester, had felt instinctively that no harm would befall her. She'd seen the positive outcome to the recent investigation, was steadfast to the last when others fell by the wayside. Annabel Marsh was an optimist, a romantic who truly believed that everything happened for a reason. This vision, then, was happening for a reason. What she was being shown had deep meaning. She was being offered insight, a special kind of insight, reserved for those in need of liberation. And then the previously still waters stirred before her. Ripples were forming at its center. Annabel observed a swelling beneath the surface. Something was emerging from the heart of the dock. It was a human head, a sopping wet pate. Was it the hotelier, that plain-faced man who had seemed so inconspicuous to her? Or was it someone who looked just like him, someone equally unmemorable? Then the person said, through soggy lips, "Have you seen enough, Miss Marsh?" Annabel found herself nodding automatically. The man in the water beckoned to her, cords of seaweed betwixt his clammy fingers. It was the hotelier. She was sure of that now. He deemed it necessary to show her this place, the harbour and the dilapidated boats. There was more to the man in the brown suit than met the eye. Of this she was absolutely certain. Annabel obeyed the summons. Back across the beach of pebbles she strolled, till her naked feet came into contact with the icy waters. In she stepped, wading deeper and deeper into the murky pool, till she was within arm's reach of the sodden hotelier. Extending her hand, the plain-faced man took it, and together they sank like stones. Annabel opened her eyes. She was lying in the tub, the scent of lavender permeating the air. The water was still warm, but the foam suds had all but dissipated.
The boneyard,
she whispered significantly.
I've been to the boneyard.
What the boneyard was a fact she'd learn later that evening, when the curious hotelier, whoever he was, came knocking at her door. Chapter 11. The Spirit Photographer. Maurice Turner announced the evening's latest arrival at the Zetland Hotel. The man behind the desk, the plain-faced chap in the brown suit and immaculately polished brogues, looked up at Maurice and nodded respectfully. "Ah, yes," he said, proceeding to scribble the man's name down in the guest book before him. He then turned to face the key rack to his rear and carefully unhooked the key to room 11, one of only 2 remaining. "Busy tonight?" Maurice ventured, as the hotelier turned to face him again. "Quite so," the plain-faced man said, then took off towards the stairs, signaling for the guest with grey hair and round glasses to follow him. Suite 11 was located on the first floor, accessed via the east corridor. As the pair went, Maurice noticed the unusual vault-like door belonging to Suite 13. "Is that the royal suite?" he asked, rather loudly. The hotelier politely shushed him, then whispered, "Yes." "Sorry," Maurice muttered. "It's quite all right, Mr. Turner," said the hotelier. "Be mindful, though. The guest in room 13 mustn't be disturbed." "Understood," Maurice affirmed, continuing to follow the plain-faced man along the lengthy corridor. After a brief tour of the suite, the hotelier, in his inimitable way, retreated from room 11 and returned to his station on the ground floor. "What an odd situation," Maurice mumbled, pondering the nature of the guest in the royal suite. He popped his bag on the bed, a neat 4-poster in pine, and immediately went after his camera. Maurice was a freelance photographer by trade, made ends meet by shooting weddings and corporate events during peak season. The rest of the year, however, he spent pursuing his greatest passion, spirit photography, the shooting of ghosts and ghouls in purportedly haunted locations up and down the country. The Zetland Hotel had been on his radar for a long time. He'd done the Wagon and Horses in Scarborough, the Pale Moon in Thirsk, had even travelled further afield to Shrewsbury to shoot the infamous highwayman at the Fairfax Arms. But the Zetland was different. It didn't appear in the periodicals such as Haunted Yorkshire and the Unexplained North. It was an undiscovered gem known only to a select few, those who were privy to the rare publication Spirits of the Zetland, which detailed the hotel's numerous phenomena. The Black Nun, the Corby sisters, the Stygian statue, et al. Oh, how Maurice had lorded it over his peers after laying his hands on that extraordinary paperback. And there he was, ready and raring to go with his favorite instant camera, the Polaroid 600. Maurice adored the 600. It allowed for true spontaneity, to be able to shoot and view rapidly. Spirit photography demanded such unbridled functionality, he often said, and he wasn't at all fond of digital. Stepping out of his room, he kicked things off by shooting his neighbor's door, the door belonging to room 10. The corridor was reasonably well lit, he thought, allowing for decent exposure. He shot some of the corridor's darker portions too, on the lookout for backscatter, often referred to as orbs, though Maurice's opinion on the nature of orbs as a paranormal phenomenon was far from concrete. Continuing to the landing area, he shot the curiously vast vault-like door to the royal suite, making as little noise as possible. Waiting for the ejected photo to develop, Maurice listened for sounds of activity throughout the hotel. It was deafeningly silent. Where were the other guests? Holed up in their rooms, asleep? He heard nothing to convince him of their presence. And then his eyes fell on the developed photograph in his hand. The vault-like door had been captured perfectly, brightly illuminated by the chandelier above. But something else had been captured too, the suggestion of a translucent figure standing next to the door's unusual 5-spoke handle. Maurice frowned as he beheld it, and looked up from the photograph to the door itself. Whatever had been captured on film was invisible to the naked eye. He shot the door again, but after waiting for the image to develop, the translucent figure was no longer present. "What the—" Maurice muttered, shaking his head. After that, he took off along the opposite corridor, shooting doors 7 through 9, observing nothing unusual in the resulting images. Deciding against a foray up into the darkness of the second floor, he descended to the ground floor and shot the empty entrance hall. Next, the adjoining corridors host to rooms 1 through 6, after which he continued to the library. Shots taken in the library were very interesting indeed. Pictures of the Inglenook fireplace displayed faces in the dancing flames, oddly shaped faces that appeared to be shouting or singing. And he saw other images in the fire too. The strange, tortured visage of a mysterious woman, a young lady and a small dog by a window, a ramshackle harbour host to wrecked boats, myriad otherworldly towers at twilight, a creepy procession, a stack of envelopes, a featureless face. "What is this place?" Maurice asked of nobody in particular, the subject of his question being the Zetland itself, that strange hotel overlooking the North Sea, the place in which all manner of things weird and wonderful had seemingly occurred over the long years. Then off he went, in search of other things to photograph. Leaving the library, Maurice crossed the empty entrance hall once again, and followed the signs for the billiard room. He was certain he could hear the hotelier wandering the halls above him, the distinctive tread, coupled with the steps of a new arrival, perhaps. Reaching the billiard room, a reasonably sized space, host to, aside from the billiard table itself, a dartboard, a chessboard, a jukebox, and a well-stocked bar, Maurice pulled out his camera and began shooting once again. He was anxious now. His experience by the door to room 13 and the myriad images he'd captured in the library had spurred him on. He shot the billiard table, the dartboard, the jukebox, and the bar. He shot the lights above the table, the darts and the chess pieces, the many spirits behind the bar. But none of the resulting photographs produced anything of interest. It was following the shooting of a window, an oval window on the north wall of the room, that the strangeness presented itself. As the photograph developed before his eyes, he saw that the outline of a figure had been captured, as though the person in question had been standing just outside the moment he pressed the shutter down. Clearer and clearer the image became, revealing further minutiae. Strange hair and a stranger mouth, giant jet-black eyes like discs, a rubbery face like that of a puppet. And then the thing in the photograph moved. Its elastic head bobbed up and down before Maurice's eyes. He would have dropped it if the creature's dark orbs hadn't held him fixed in place. And then it spoke.
"Can I come in?"
Though the words sounded from the surface of the photograph, Maurice perceived the voice as though it was emanating from the back of his mind. What was this thing that was capable of communicating with him through the medium of film? And then it spoke again.
"Let me in, and I'll grant you a wish."
A wish? Maurice repeated.
"Yes?"
It confirmed. Maurice simply nodded, feeling utterly under the thing's command. And what followed was beyond the spirit photographer's ability to process. A tiny, pale hand emerged from the photograph, penetrating the invisible membrane between the image's two-dimensional plane and Maurice's three-dimensional reality. The hand was smooth and magnolia, its fingers slender and malleable. The aperture through which it was forcing itself grew wider and wider, like a nascent sinkhole. When a second hand emerged, followed by two spindly arms, Maurice let go of the photograph, but it floated there in mid-air as a mound of disheveled, greasy hair appeared before him. The man in the round glasses gasped as the terrible face came into view, that dreadful imitation of a little girl, those dead eyes and shark-like teeth. And there it paused, its incomprehensible hold over Maurice unyielding.
"Your wish?"
Came the alien tones of the doe-like organism in his midst. There was no hesitation. It came to Maurice instantaneously. It was in his life's work, in his motivation to seek out haunted dwellings and to capture spirits on film. It was in a question, the question to end all questions, the final question. "Life after death," Maurice blurted. "I wish for proof of life after death." The thing nodded, then vanished before Maurice's eyes. The photograph of the oval window fell like a feather to the parquet, as the man with the grey hair fought to understand what had happened to him. Filled with a new anxiousness, a nervousness ascribable to a promise about to be fulfilled, Maurice Turner returned to his room on the first floor. He paid no mind to the hotelier as he passed the reception desk, nor was his attention drawn to the mystery beyond the door to room 13. He was a man on the cusp of a great discovery. He could feel it in his old bones. Chapter 12. The Expected. Newton Lyman was the final guest to check in to the Zetland Hotel that fateful evening. He had, however, been lingering in the vicinity of the hotel for most of the day, was parked on an esplanade bench when the excitable Ian MacDonald arrived, found himself planted between two trees in the neighbouring Rainbow Park when Julia Carlyle wandered onto the grounds on foot, had his head wedged between the rails of the perimeter fencing when the anxious Lucille Sharples strolled into the building, saw them all arrive, with the exception of the guest in room 13, that is. Newton, a self-proclaimed occult expert, had been on the trail of somebody for many years, an individual referred to in certain circles by the simple moniker Brownie. Brownie, also known as the Shadow Man, was a mysterious figure, the stuff of campfire legend, a man from elsewhere, it was said, rumoured to visit those in need of deliverance on cold winter nights. Brownie, whose face was as featureless as the ocean at midnight, was inclined to visit all kinds, the weak and the downtrodden, the corrupt and the sinners, a magistrate in plain clothes, tasked with a simple duty, to offer roads to redemption, to give all, the good and the bad, a second chance. But the burning question was, why? Theories abounded. Brownie was an apparition, a figment of the imagination, the product of collective hysteria, as he often appeared to many. The Shadow Man just wasn't of this earth, an alien being with a mysterious interest in this pale blue dot. Brownie was merely a charlatan, a fraudster capable of cold-reading guilt in order to proffer steps for repentance. But regardless, these theories, banal or fantastic, still implored of the theorist, why? And what of the strangeness associated with this peculiar individual? The unusual occurrences later committed to the pages of paranormal journals and supernatural surveys. The black-eyed kids and the out-of-place artifacts, the monstrous cryptids and the lights in the sky. Coincidence? Or did the very presence of the Shadow Man trigger these events? Newton Lyman was obsessed with Brownie, had been searching for him for almost 7 years, listening to the weird stories recalled in quiet drinking holes, when the punters therein could remember that was. "He'll have a letter with your name on it," one tipsy gent had said to Newton during his investigations in the Midlands. "Knows what you've been up to. Warns you against getting up to it again." Brownie, it seemed, had unfathomable insight. But how? And again, why? The man with the sandy hair and rough complexion had come to the Zetland to find out. A recent conversation with a young lady in the Cambrian town of Maryport had revealed a remarkably interesting morsel of information. She'd once spent a night at a guest house in the forest of Bowland, a guest house operated by an individual she described to be a very unusual and notably quiet man in a brown suit. The lady had been disturbed in the night, she said, when something had been slipped under her door a little after midnight, an envelope with her name on it, the letter within outlining an intimate knowledge of an affair she was having, of the hurt and suffering she and her lover were causing the unwitting parties. The lady had kept Brownie's letter, and it was the first Newton had laid his eyes on. Such precise cursive, such damning words. Later, Newton paid a visit to the guest house in the forest of Bowland, the Hodder Lodge in Newton and Bowland, no less, the absurdity of the village name describing his situation not lost on the investigator. But there was no record of a man matching Brownie's description having ever operated the lodge. It had been in the same family for over 3 decades, but there had been some unusual activity there over the years. Phantoms spotted in the corridors at night, indistinct voices whispering in dark corners, the usual run-of-the-mill stuff for the most part, with the exception of a journal that had apparently been left behind by a guest one evening, or so the owners presumed. This journal, a book of some 50 pages or so, was filled with what appeared to be gibberish scribble, shapes and patterns the likes of which a practicing doodler would be very proud, apart from 2 very distinct words on page 13 that, when shown to Newton, stood out like a skyscraper in the Cotswolds. Zetland Hotel. What this implied, Newton wasn't sure, but it became his new obsession. There were several hotels by that name, predominantly in the northeast, but it was the original Zetland Hotel in Redcar and Cleveland, overlooking the North Sea, that the investigator was drawn to. He read everything he could on the hotel, unearthed historic volumes dating back to the time of its construction, spent time with the Heritage Society in Saltburn, read the travel books as penned by wealthy vacationers in its heyday. And it was in the pages of such a book that the very first account of strangeness met his greedy, searching eyes. One Charles Allen Smith wrote of a painting, a portrait of a mysterious subject, unknown to the proprietors at the time. Newton found this to be particularly intriguing, as the Zetland in the early 20th century still belonged to the family that had built it, the Dovecrofts. If the Dovecrofts hadn't placed the portrait there, then who had? Even Smith, ostensibly, had been baffled by the enigmatic portrait, noting in his book, "The identity of its haunting subject is a mystery, of a lineage seemingly unknown to the proprietors, a dazzling beauty left to brood in the shadows, of a hand apparently gone from this world. One is seized by the impression that the striking image was forced into the darkness of those upper halls, by way of punishment, perhaps, if that forlorn expression it wears is anything to go by." In the present day, Newton Lyman had attempted to gain access to the second floor of the Zetland on several occasions, only to fail in the presence of insurmountable barriers and watchful camera eyes. The current proprietors of the Zetland insisting that the second floor was strictly off-limits, that all items located there, paintings or otherwise, were of great value, and that all items required careful analysis and classification before public access could even be considered. Newton had done all he could, read everything, met with everybody willing to talk, visited the hotel, stayed at the hotel, and yet not once was the elusive Brownie even so much as hinted at. But the oddity of the painting remained, a secret he yearned to lay his eyes upon. He often considered a very singular notion. Was the wonder of that shadowy work of art the seed from which strangeness might later grow? And then he awoke one morning, that strange December morning, filled with a perplexing desire to visit the Zetland Hotel once more. He didn't question it, simply climbed into his car and drove again the 200 miles from King's Lynn to Redcar and Cleveland. He parked nearby, just a few streets down from that little hillock upon which the Zetland was perched, and loitered on the periphery of the old place, studying. It was different, somehow. All was quiet surrounding the hotel. The esplanade was dead. The little streets, usually busy with pedestrians, were utterly devoid of life. The North Sea was uncharacteristically calm. The wisps of cloud trailing overhead were sluggish and few. Having spent almost the entire day sneaking about, drinking tea from a flask and peeing in bushes, Newton took a deep breath and finally entered the grounds of the hotel proper. He passed the cars parked there, saw the various suites brightly lit, pondered the gloom of room 13 above the entrance. He stepped into the reception area, and was immediately warmed by the bountiful Christmas trees there to greet him, either side of the grand mahogany desk. And then he saw him. The man he'd chased for almost 7 years knew it was him instantly. The brown suit and the tidy hair, the plain face and the empty grin. "Brownie," he all but said aloud. What was at work here? Had the Shadow Man the means to commandeer hotels for his own purposes? Where was Mrs. Anstice, the owner? Where was Mr. Anstice, for that matter? Was it Brownie's presence here at the Zetland today that had summoned Newton? Called to him? Was he expected? As if in answer to the occult expert's chain of thought, the stationary hotelier said, "Good evening. Looking for a room for the night?" The perpetual grin that adorned the man's face filled Newton with trepidation. Yes," he managed, eyeballing the key rack to the rear of the hotelier. He saw that only one key remained, the key to room number 12, the last available suite at the hotel. Serendipity, or something else? "Splendid," sounded the plain-faced man. "Your name?" Lyman. Newton Lyman." He couldn't be entirely sure, but the occult expert could have sworn that the hotelier started adding his name to the guest book in front of him a mere fraction of a second before the words left his mouth. Listening to the not-too-distant sound of a camera clicking on and off, Newton followed the hotelier upstairs towards room 12. He found himself in a sort of trance, his eyes glued to those neat brogues, the uncreased suit, that stilted gait that was almost inhuman. He was in the company of Brownie, at last. Allowing the plain-faced man to conduct a tour of room 12, he continued to follow him around the suite, studying his every move, his every word. Even the way his lips moved troubled him. Here were lips that struggled to form certain shapes, behind which a bothersome tongue flapped about, impeding the articulation of certain consonants. Then Newton blurted, "Where are you from, if you don't mind me asking?" "From?" came the flat tones of the hotelier, apparently unfazed by the question. "North, sir." "Right," Newton acknowledged, nodding. "Scotland?" "Not quite," the plain-faced man returned, shaking his head. "Northumberland." "Right," Newton said again. Then followed the hotelier's warning concerning the occupant of room 13, in response to which Newton simply nodded, vowing his compliance. "If anything isn't to your liking, Mr. Lyman, come see me at the main desk." "To be sure," said the occult expert, and watched the man he believed to be Brownie retreat into the dimly lit corridor. Closing the door behind him, Newton gawped at the imposing grandfather clock in the corner of the suite. It was a little after 9 p.m. His mind raced. He'd pursued this puzzling character for years, chased down every bit of information he could on the man, sat with villagers all over the place, listened to their tales with feverish interest. But now that he was within arm's reach of the Shadow Man, he was at a loss as to what to do about it. The man he believed to be Brownie had said he was from Northumberland, not exactly alien territory, and certainly not a realm of the imagination, but conceivably the origin of a charlatan? That was a real possibility. Naturally, Newton found the hotelier to be a little peculiar, unremarkable, just as all those eyewitnesses had proclaimed. But was he a product of the supernatural? How could Newton be sure? The sandy-haired man threw himself on the four-poster bed. He was knackered. Though unseasonably warm for the time of year, it had been cold enough outside to creep into his extremities. His hands and feet were practically numb. He climbed under the duvet, years of unresolved research clouding both his mind and his judgment. It didn't take long for him to surrender to the coziness of the nest. With thoughts of neat brogues and an uncreased suit plaguing him, he drifted off. In approximately 3 hours' time, a gentle tapping at his door would rouse the occult expert from a deep slumber. Chapter 13. The Unexpected. Brownie, a.k.a. the Shadow Man, having shown his latest and final guest to room 12, returned to the reception area and went about making his concluding preparations. Generic duties seen to, those everyday tasks befitting a would-be desk clerk, he perused the stack of envelopes pushed to one side, checking each one and its contents scrupulously. Brownie was ill-equipped to ponder, and so, paying no mind to Mr. Turner as he passed through the entrance hall, a look of silent wonder stamped across his tired face, the hotelier simply stared into space, listening to the heavy ticking of the clockmaker's dial on the wall behind him. The time was nigh. At exactly 12:02 a.m., the Shadow Man knocked at the door belonging to room 2. A dog barked, followed by a series of footsteps. Emma Norling, her faithful companion Amadeus by her side, pulled open the door. Her bright eyes met Brownie's, but no words were exchanged. The plain-faced man gestured for her to follow him as he continued to room 3. It was coming up to 12:03 when Brownie tapped at Mr. Burroughs' door. The grinning 72-year-old appeared at the threshold a few short moments later, greeting both the hotelier and, in turn, Emma, who had strolled up beside him. Again, the man in the brown suit said nothing at all, merely signalled for John to join him. Just as the pleasant 20-something had done, the elderly man left his room and followed Brownie and the young lady across the entrance hall. The shadow man passed the door to room 4 and stopped outside room 5. A gentle tap, 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 and Elaine Olson was soon standing before the small party, more than willing to join them. Then Brownie was at the door to room 6, summoning Pip Farmington. Pip looked a little worse for wear when he answered the call, but, like the others, intrigued by the tranquil formality of it all, joined the group, and off they went in the direction of the stairs. By 12:07, the ocean lover, Mark Patterson, had been roused from a comfortable snooze and was in the act of joining the other guests as they moved towards room 8. 12:08, and Mary Henderson was up and about, nodding and smirking, more than a little curious with regards to the nature of the midnight jaunt. Like room 4, room 9 was bypassed too, the small company heedless of the royal suite's vault-like door as they approached room 10 across the landing. Annabel Marsh heard the knocking just after 12:10 and answered the call with fervour. Her vision in the bathtub had prepared her for the mysterious hotelier's coming, though the purpose of his call was still unknown to her. She looked at the others standing alongside him. Did some of those faces belong to the names she'd seen on the boats in the boneyard? The hotelier signalled for her to join them, and she did without hesitation. 12:11 saw the addition of Maurice Turner to the party, the man in the round glasses who, to the rest of the guests gathered there in the corridor, looked as though he'd seen a ghost. 12:12, and Newton Lyman was stirred from an accidental nap, a look of genuine surprise on his coarse face as he opened the door to room 12. Still, in spite of the rude awakening, the occult expert was more than happy to join the small party. Hadn't he dreamt of Brownie's coming? At last, the guests were gathered, and the procession could commence. Silently, Brownie led the guests, 9 of them in all, towards the landing. Somehow, each of them knew where they were being guided, and when the would-be hotelier stopped with his back to room 13, they automatically mustered round him, forming a circle. "Ladies and gentlemen," Brownie began, his tone, as always, monotonous, "I bring tidings." Reaching into an inside pocket, he withdrew 9 envelopes. "Emma Norling," he announced, and handed the topmost envelope to the young lady who was seeing to her aunt in Gisborough. Amadeus, it has to be said, uttered not even a whimper as the exchange took place. "John Burroughs," he said, handing the second envelope to the 72-year-old who had bidden farewell to the old steelworks. "Elaine Olson," Brownie continued, and passed the third envelope to the elderly lady who had clutched the memory maker in order to feast upon visions of yesteryear. Philip Farmington was the next to be called, the man who had looked guilt in the face as it burned with loathing in the library fireplace. "Mark Patterson," said the hotelier, passing the 5th envelope to the guest with the gambling problem, the man who had caught a glimpse of the evening's proceedings. "Mary Henderson," came the monotonous tones again, as the lady who had been held up shopping came forth to claim her letter. "Annabel Marsh," Brownie called, handing the 7th letter to she who had visited the boneyard, a woman whose exceptional sensitivity had taken her closer to strangeness than any in the company of the Shadow Man had ever been before. "Maurice Turner," sounded the hotelier, this time nodding slightly as he passed the 8th envelope to the man who encountered the putty girl in the billiard room. Newton Lyman was the last to be called, and the occult expert tiptoed forward like a frightened animal, accepting his envelope with a touch of reluctance. "These tidings are of the utmost importance," Brownie declared, his face barely discernible now, "for you have a decision to make. Some of you, I believe, have already made it." Several heads nodded. "To those of you who have done so, I invite you to open your letter." 4 of the 9 guests proceeded to open their envelopes: John, Elaine, Pip, and Maurice. "John," Brownie invited. "It says, 'Permission granted.'" "Elaine, Pip, Maurice," the shadow man prompted. "Permission granted," said Pip, who was quickly echoed by Elaine. Then, after some deliberation, Maurice. "I invite the 4 of you to step into room 13. Our special guest is ready to see you now." The spirit photographer, Maurice Turner, broke into a sweat as the man in the brown suit turned to face the vault-like door and began to dial its massive 5-spoke handle. The outline of the hotelier's figure, twisted in the act of spinning the vast wheel, was precisely the image Maurice had captured on film just a few hours prior. What's on the other side?" Maurice asked nervously, trembling like a child on the verge of tears. "In your case," sounded Brownie's inimitable tones, "the answer to a great question." Maurice dabbed at the beads of sweat peppering his brow. I don't think I can." "Don't fret, Mr. Turner," the hotelier reassured. "There's nothing to be afraid of." A mighty clatter sounded, and just like that, the door to the royal suite was unlocked. The shadow man pushed the heavy door forwards, and it swung open, revealing a dark space beyond. Light from the landing seemed to terminate at the threshold, masking the contents of the mysterious suite entirely. "You may proceed," the blank-faced man encouraged, addressing the 4 individuals to whom permission to enter had allegedly been granted. Who's in there?" Maurice ventured, his voice wavering. "A friend," Brownie asserted. "A guide, if you will." John, Elaine, and Pip strolled headlong into the darkness. Elaine especially wasn't at all afraid. The vault-like door possessed the same surface characteristics that had belonged to her short-lived sphere. She would put all of her unanswered questions to the special guest on the other side. But Maurice hesitated. "Fear not, Mr. Turner," Brownie comforted. "Your time has come." Panic consumed the spirit photographer. His mind was awash with the strange things he'd witnessed earlier that evening, awash with the strange practices he'd subjected himself to over the long years. Now that he was within arm's reach of the answers he sought, he found himself paralyzed. I don't want to." "It's far too late for that, Mr. Turner," came the hollow tones of the shadow man, and as Maurice felt the import of those words, he caught sight of a figure along the neighboring corridor, a small, childlike figure wreathed in shadow, a very familiar figure. "I'll grant you a wish," it had said, and he'd asked for that wish. It had granted that wish, and through this shadowy portal was the fulfillment of that wish. He couldn't walk away now. He wouldn't be permitted to walk away. Those were the terms of the deal. The spirit photographer swallowed audibly, then took a tentative step towards the murky aperture. He shuffled towards it, his senses overwrought, but still nothing met his gaze beyond the threshold. There were no sounds to hear, no scents to smell, nothing in the air to taste. All that remained was the elementary sense of touch, his heavy feet making contact with the carpeted floor as he ambled, step by step, towards the mouth of the monster. Brownie watched as the 52-year-old crossed the threshold, listened to the final, erratic beats of the man's heart as he vanished into the realm beyond. 4 of them had entered room 13. 4 of them were now at the mercy of the Zetland's most illustrious guest. But the Shadow Man was ill-equipped to ponder, and so he plainly observed as the gigantic, vault-like door was closed from within by hidden hands. He turned his attention once more to the remaining guests. Emma Norling and her dog Amadeus, Mark Patterson, Mary Henderson, Annabel Marsh, and Newton Lyman. "As for the rest of you," he began, pointing towards the letters in their hands, "mark my words. These tidings are of the utmost importance. Adhere to the words printed therein, or I will be obliged to return." Only Mark Patterson, a gambling man, would have ventured the following question. "And I'm guessing that would be a bad thing?" "Mr. Patterson," Brownie replied, "my return would involve the premature opening of this door." The sausage dog, Amadeus, let out the tiniest of whimpers, whilst Mark, blushing, took a step back, sensing that he'd overstepped his mark. And so followed the Shadow Man's closing words. "Please, return to your rooms." Like automata, the 5 remaining guests did exactly that. In the privacy of their suites, they each studied their handwritten letters. In room 2, Emma Norling was befuddled by a blank piece of paper. Had she been a witness and nothing more? Not even Amadeus could illuminate her in this respect. In room 7, Mark Patterson was cautioned concerning the nature of his addictive personality. A destructive force it was. The key to redemption, attenuation. In room 8, Mary Henderson was reminded of the true value of simple human interaction. The material world would ruin not only her, but the lives of her children, too. In room 10, Annabel Marsh finally understood the implications of her visit to the boneyard, the tired boats and the illegible names. The lives of human beings are much the same. Through the passage of time, we grow feeble and decrepit. With the decline of our minds follows the end of our days. Our faces and names are eventually forgotten, washed up on the silent sands of some halfway place. In room 12, the occult expert, Newton Lyman, was told of the error of his ways, the futility of his purpose. Mortal man vainly pursuing elaborate ideas above his station. He was instructed to enjoy the life he'd been given, to taste of humble pleasures. But there was a shared notion that each of the remaining guests just couldn't help but consider. What gave this unremarkable character in the brown suit and tidy brogues the right to pass judgment over them? Who was he, and where did he come from? Perhaps the answers to such questions would be provided by the very thing that they each knew would greet them upon the inevitable crossing of that dark threshold. The Zetland's special guest, who to disturb would be to commit a great, great sin. The Shadow Man, having watched the remaining guests vacate the landing, headed in the direction of room 9. Entering the quiet suite, he collected the painting now host to the merged renderings of Julia Carlyle and Lucille Sharples, and proceeded in the direction of the stairs. Joined by his short, rubbery associate, the putty girl, he ascended to the 2nd floor and roamed the halls in quest of a certain passage leading to a certain space beneath a vaulted ceiling. Hanging the painting, Brownie looked down at the curious creature standing at his side.
"It is done,"
came the queer voice of the putty girl in response to the unspoken needs of the man in the brown suit. The Shadow Man grinned. "The cycle continues," he muttered. Then, patting the imitation of a child on its bobbing head, "We're as stars. Brightly we shine. Too soon do we dwindle." And with those parting words, The man in the brown suit inexplicably vanished, tumbled down the years, to be judge, jury, and executioner in a Victorian Britain. The putty girl, on the other hand, returned to the ether, set to rain down as per her master's command. If you enjoyed listening today, be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button to receive new content notifications. If you'd like to support our work and receive exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. To support us in other ways, see the video description for links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, our merch store over at Teespring, and further information relating to our releases on Audible, iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time,